Chapter 40. Moreover the Lord answered Job and said, Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said, Gird up thy loins now like a man. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? Hast thou an arm like God, or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold every one that is proud, and abase him. Look on every one that is proud, and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together, and bind their faces in secret. Then will I confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. Behold now, Behemoth, which I made with thee, he eateth grass as an ox. Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar, the sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are as strong pieces of brass, his bones are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God, he that made him can make his sword to approach unto him. Surely the mountains bring him forth food, where all the beasts of the field play. He lieth under the shady trees, in the covert of the reed and fens. The shady trees cover him with their shadow, the willows of the brook compass him about. Behold, he drinketh up a river, and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. He taketh it with his eyes, his nose pierceth through snares. In chapter 40 here, we're almost at the end of Job. And I think there's a few things we really need to keep in mind as we're thinking back over this. And the first one is that Job is not a prophet. He is, according to the story, and we don't know when the story took place. We don't know whether the story is based on a real individual or who wrote the story, or whether or not it's pure fiction. All we know is that the Hebrew scholars at one point figured that this was so valuable for instruction that they wanted it included with their scriptures. And that's why it's in the Old Testament. That's the only reason why it's in the Old Testament. It had been accepted for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before the Savior came. And the Old Testament was taken in pretty well entirely as to part of the scriptures, and Job with it. And we don't know whether or not it's entirely fictional, whether it's based on a real individual whose history and story were so well known. But we know a couple of things. Number one, we know that bad things happen to good people. We also know that people who have bad things happen to them also tend to be judged by people as having brought those things upon themselves. And how do you deal with that if you are righteous and you haven't done things? And this is an examination of all of those things. It's also an examination of God's dealings with mankind. How does God deal with us? How do we look upon and deal with God? How do we relate to God? These are all critical issues for our eternal well-being. And just because something bad happens to us doesn't mean God did it. Doesn't mean we did it. Doesn't mean we deserve it. Doesn't mean anybody deserves it. Sometimes bad things just happen to good people. That's part of life here on earth. The one thing that seems to be the most talked about in this chapter, actually, well, the two things is, in the very first part it says, does a man who contends with God going to instruct him? And that's a superb question. If you're going to argue with God, do you think you're smart enough to teach him anything? That's a really good question to have a really good answer to. And if you think you're smart enough to teach God something, you go right ahead and you just let him know. I'm sure he'll be very happy to find out that you're smarter than he is. You might find out something too. Last but not least, the story of the behemoth. And people get really hung up on this thing. Just amazes me how people get hung up on these things. I know there are people, lots of people, who want to believe that every single word in the Bible is absolutely, literally true. And therefore they have to find out what behemoth means. Same as they have to find out what unicorn was in the previous chapter. And there are guys who consider that the unicorn was the Indian rhinoceros because it has one horn. And in its Latin name, it has unicornus or something or other as part of its name. Excuse me, that was given to it because it has one horn, not because it's related to the unicorn talked about in the Bible. Somehow those two just don't really get connected to some people. The facts of the matter don't seem to matter too much. But according to Hebrew mythology, Hebrew fiction, at the beginning of the creation of the world, there were two animals created. One was called Leviathan, and it was the female, and it was the biggest animal in the ocean. And the second one that was created was male, and it was the biggest animal on the land. And that when the earth is going to be at the end of the earth, these two are going to have a battle. They're both going to die, and whoever's alive at that point in time will finish off the meat. That's the story. I think that is pure fiction. If there is an animal alive that can, as it says in this chapter, take up the whole of the Jordan River in its mouth, I would like to see it. I'm open to seeing it. You just have to say where it is and send me a picture and I will believe it. Leviathan, could be a whale, could be anything. I have no idea. The drawings of it are always interesting. Looks something like a partway between a dinosaur and a dragon, some sort of thing. I think these things are used as literary devices to try and explain things that don't have other explanations, or to add interest to stories that otherwise look pretty dull to the author or the people who were telling them. And that's all I think they represent. When the winding up of the earth comes, we will find out for sure. And I don't think it's really going to make a great deal of difference to your eternal well-being whether or not Behemoth and Leviathan are what other people claim them to be, whether they're dinosaurs or whatever. I think it's totally irrelevant.